to be America's, quote, golden age of prosperity, at least according to many financial analysts, is off to an historically rocky start. Right now, the markets are recovering from yesterday's big sell-off on Wall Street, triggered by the president's continued attacks against Fed Chair Jerome Powell. But we want to zoom out for a moment and look at the headlines about where things stand 3 months into Donald Trump's presidency and his self-induced trade war. The clock is ticking for the White House to negotiate literally dozens of trade deals before that 90-day tariff pause expires. So far, not a single one has materialized. The Dow is headed for its worst April since, get this, the Great Depression. U.S. stocks are having their worst start to a presidency in more than a century, 1928 to be exact. And today, the International Monetary Fund slashed its forecast for economic growth. Its chief economist now predicting a 40% chance of recession, due mostly to those tariffs. The White House is responding by pretty much focusing on everything except the economy, including issues like immigration and deportation. Joining us now to unpack and explain, we've got NBC News White House correspondent Vaughn Hillyard and NBC News senior business correspondent Christine Ruffini. Christine, I want to start with this IMF thing because the spring meetings are actually happening in D.C. this week. I imagine there's going to be a lot of talk about this IMF growth revision. How significant is this prediction coming from this chief economist, who what I would imagine carries some weight in this field?
Well, look, you're talking about dramatically slashing growth expectations for the U.S. and the rest of the world. And by the way, the U.S. faring worse than the rest of the world when you look at these growth forecasts, 1.8% growth this year. And it is because tariffs pose major headwinds to the U.S. and the global economy. So this is, the big high-end IMF, the ivory tower telling you what every small business owner and medium-sized business owner and employer has been saying top to bottom in the U.S. economy, that these tariffs are going to remake how trade is done, and that is going to slow things down and be disruptive in the near term here.
And Vaughn, the administration has said they're confident that they can make, more than 90 some odd trade deals in the 90-day tariff hiatus window. Have we heard any progress on how that's going? Are deals materializing? How is the White House approaching the markets?
We haven't heard details in terms of specifics, other than Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary, now suggesting that 100 different countries are engaging. And one other specific country that she noted here just this afternoon that we're going to talk about more on the back end. Take a listen.
We're doing very well in respect to a potential trade deal with China. As I mentioned, there have now been 18 proposals in more than 100 countries around the world who are wanting to make a deal with the United States of America. And the president and the administration are setting the stage for a deal with China.
Setting the stage for a deal with China. What does that mean? Has the president spoken directly with Xi yet?
I don't have anything to read out on a direct talk between the president and President Xi.
And those remarks are notable because our colleague Catherine Doyle just put in a note that Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, was speaking just today at a private investor summit behind closed doors. We don't have this on camera, but she sent over notes in which Secretary Bessent is indicating that the direct engagement, actual negotiations with China have not yet started, but at the same time suggested that both sides understand that this is not a long-term solution and that having tariffs at 125%, 145% is not good for anybody involved, and that he expects, to note, de-escalation to come soon, remarking that there is going to be a moment here over the next weeks in which there is going to be engagement and that there is a posit over in the very near future that there's going to be a de-escalation here. I think it's notable remarks. At the same time, Christine went through this during the first Trump administration. The negotiation with China, as the secretary points out, it's a slog. And so what are the details? What does engagement look like? When do those that engagement begin? There's a lot of outstanding questions.
Yeah, and they even have to create some of the channels to have the negotiations because these are not two countries that have a lot of working level relationships. Christine, I also want to ask you, why are the markets so rattled by Trump's repeated attacks on Jerome Powell? We've seen the stocks and the dollar start to tumble. Can you explain why pressuring the Fed to cut interest rates could, I mean, it could potentially spur economic growth, but there's also this huge risk of out of control inflation. Can you break that down?
Yeah, the big concern for global investors, and I think you see that when you see them selling stocks, bonds, and the U.S. dollar, that's unusual. Usually when there's uncertainty, investors flood to the safe haven of U.S. Treasuries, and you're not seeing that relationship. It's been broken here in the near term. And one of the worries is the independence of the Federal Reserve, which is really what guides the U.S. economy. I like to use the metaphor of, the shock absorber. However the President of the United States and Congress are driving the car, the Fed is the shock absorber there to try to smooth out the bumps and braking. And if you don't have that shock absorber and it's not independent, you lose your luster as such an important destination for international capital. So that's one of the reasons here. It's more uncertainty if the Fed's if the president's trying to remake the Fed or take control of the Fed in any way, or even boot Jerome Powell, which Powell and many legal experts say is illegal. That would just add more uncertainty on top of all of this uncertainty, and that has really, really alarmed investors around the world.
I also want to ask you, the S&P 500 since Trump's inauguration, we've got this chart compared to past administrations. It was down almost 14%, here we go, through yesterday. All three indexes are down more than 9% since whatever we're calling Liberation Day. But markets are up big today. What is with these huge swings day to day? I'm exhausted. I'm sure you're exhausted. But does that exhaustion at some point start to permeate the market?
I've covered markets a long time, and we kind of roll our eyes when people use roller coaster and whiplash, in headlines, because it's just so easy. But this is when you can use roller coaster and whiplash, because that is what this is here. Today, you're seeing this bounce back on what Vaughn was saying about these comments, these reported comments behind the scenes, behind closed doors to big investors, that maybe it can't get worse with China, and somehow there has to be an off-ramp, although we don't see what that is. But these big moves just show you these dramatic moves and these superlatives, worse since the Great Recession, worst April since the Great Recession, the worst beginning of a president's, the S&P under a new president ever. I mean, those just show you the very big things that are happening in the Trump administration, and the very big anxiety about them through the people who actually move money.
High on anxiety, running low on superlatives. Vaughn, Hillyard, and Christina Ruffini, thank you so much.